Well, welcome to this sessions. And
Good morning.
we have the first presentations of Professor Iván Song with the paper, multidimensional approach based in analytic network process for earthquake vulnerability assessment and policy development, a case of study of Ayacucho, Peru. Okay, Iván, you have between 10 minutes for your presentation.
Okay, thank you.
Good morning, everyone. My presentation is entitled A Multidimensional Approach Based on the Analytic Network Process for Earthquake Vulnerability.
Excuse me.
Good morning, everyone. My presentation is entitled A Multidimensional Approach Based on the Analytic Network Process for Earthquake Vulnerability Assessment and Policy Development, a case study of Ayacucho, Peru. Natural and human-made disasters have claimed victims and caused material and economic damage over time and are becoming more frequent. Taking into account that the total number of deaths by the type of disaster that occurred in the last decade, we can see that people killed by earthquakes are 58% of the total recorded, constituting the main threat. That is why I am motivated to raise the problem of identifying, prioritizing, and mitigating vulnerabilities from the point of view of the territory, since the greater the vulnerability to danger, the greater the disaster. Moreover, there is no holistic understanding of vulnerability through the integration of its dimensions and the use of indicators. Additionally, there is no adequate and systematic identification of vulnerabilities. As a consequence, the estimation of the vulnerability indices is unreliable because they often use a weight equal to their dimensions, or vulnerable elements. The general objective is to design a decision-making model based on the analytical network process that, based on the evaluation of criteria that affect vulnerability to earthquakes, can generate vulnerability indicators and prioritize strategic mitigation policies. If we take into account that disaster risk is a function of two variables, hazard and vulnerability, the impact of a threat or danger on a social system is determined by the degree of vulnerability of that system. The characteristic of the vulnerability is that it is due to the susceptibility of the population, of the physical structure or of the socioeconomic activities to suffer damages due to the action of hazard. Also due to the exposure, fragility and susceptibility to deterioration or loss of the elements and aspects that generate and improve social existence. Being the uncontrollable hazard, it is an expected fact. On the contrary, the vulnerability can be controllable, but it is specific to a territory and therefore it is important to estimate it. A multi-criteria decision-making technique that can better structure vulnerability is the analytical network process. This provides a solution for problems that cannot be structured in a rigid hierarchical way. The problem is represented as a network of criteria grouped into clusters. Pairwise comparison to determine the relative importance of each element and its impact on other elements. It also provides more accurate modeling of complex configuration, interdependence within and between criterion clusters, and this also offers a set of alternatives to better inform decision makers. The proposed methodological model presents three steps. Step 1 is to determine the vulnerable elements of the territory for each dimension of vulnerability based on the literature review, selection of experts. Step 2 is the application of AMP to determine the vulnerability indicators based on the determination of dimensions of vulnerability, clusters, and vulnerable elements. In step 3, with the data obtained in step 2, we formulate policies and strategies to mitigate vulnerability with the support of the experts and identify stakeholders. This is the application of the methodological model, the study case. The application area is the urban metropolitan area of the city of Ayacucho. This would be in a city in the Andes with seismic record and irregular geography. Some social data are shown such as the Human Development Index, illiteracy rate, and poverty. In the case of Ayacucho, the vulnerable elements were determined: 6 in the environmental dimension, 6 in the social dimension, and 3 in the economic dimension. The paired relationships between the criteria or vulnerable elements were executed in the influence matrix. The decision problem was modeled as a network in the superdecision software, with the relationships between the elements determined in the influence matrix shown in the previous slide. The modeling shows that the relationships go both ways between the clusters, and each cluster is related to itself in its vulnerable elements. The results obtained show us prioritization of the dimensions. As well, the social dimension is the one that has obtained the greatest weighting. The results obtained for the ranking of the vulnerable elements confirm that the criteria of the social cluster have a greater presence in the first positions. The first 4 vulnerable elements are from the social and environmental dimension: poverty level of the population, gender, age group, and location of housing in unsafe areas. With the ranking of the vulnerable elements, the step 3 of the methodological model begins. For the criteria with the greatest influence on the vulnerability index, policies and strategies have been developed for each of its vulnerable elements. The main ones are shown. Prioritize investment in earthquake-resistant infrastructure in communities with high poverty rates. Implement subsidy and financing programs for structural improvements in housing for vulnerable populations. Establish emergency funds for communities in extreme poverty, incorporating a gender approach in risk management policies guaranteeing equal access to resources, training, and subsidies. Establish specific programs for female heads of household in vulnerable areas. All my research led me to 3 conclusions. Firstly, the proposed model allows the assessment of vulnerability to be given by the influence of the 3 dimensions: economic, social, and environmental. Secondly, the application of the Analytical Network Process, or NNP, technique is transparent. It allows knowing and fully evaluating the dimensions and criteria that affect the vulnerability index. And the last one, a better identification and assessment of vulnerability allows better decisions to be made in the formulation of policies and strategic actions for mitigating the risk of earthquakes.
Thank you, Iván Infanzón. Does anyone have a question? Any question?
I do.
Okay. Okay, thank you, Enrique.
Yes, more than a question, is going to be a suggestion. Now that you have these vulnerability indicators, it's going to be necessary to indicate for each indicator at what level the government or the authorities should really go. Yes, okay, here. These are the relative importance, correct? But you're going to develop indicators, like a scale, a rating scale for each of these indicators, right? And the next question would be, at what value of this scale, then we have a problem. For example, in location of housing in unsafe areas. If you measure that, at what level, when 10% of the houses, 20% of the houses, 30% of the houses are in trouble. Otherwise, I wouldn't know how to use it. You know? So this is a very good first step, but the question is how you're going to measure it, and when you measure it, how do you determine the threshold levels? There have been several presentations in this symposium about how to do that, and in particular, Claudio Garuti, and actually I work with him in that area, has suggested a very good way to really decide how to set up thresholds so action can be taken if that threshold is, I mean, you are above or beyond that threshold. It's just my comment.
Ok. ¿Puedo responder en español? Disculpe, doctor Enrique, pero
Okay.
sí. Cada uno de los elementos vulnerables sí tiene una escala de cuantificación, porque, bueno, estoy desarrollando la tesis doctoral y uno de los pasos es el gráfico en GIS, de mapas GIS, ¿no? Y para poder pintar también requiero esos intervalos que tiene cada uno de estos elementos vulnerables, ¿no? Por temas de tiempo no los he colocado, pero sí están en porcentaje para poder graduar también cuáles van en color rojo, en color anaranjado, para poder establecer un semáforo, ¿no? En ese sentido. Sí.
Okay. Muchas gracias.
Okay.
Yo tengo una pregunta también, Iván. Te la hago en español directamente. Esta es la sesión, entiendo, de HP en América Latina. Tenéis en esta transparencia que estamos viendo aquí, tú pones gender, predominance, gender, head of household. ¿Qué significa? O sea, ¿qué evaluáis aquí? What do you evaluate under predominance, gender, head of household? What do you mean with that?
Ok. Aquí se evalúa cuántas mujeres son jefes de hogar, ¿no?
Ok.
Y eso también influye de acuerdo a dónde está ubicado el territorio, ¿no? En Ayacucho es más alto, en Lima podría ser menor, o en otra ciudad con mayor desarrollo económico podría ser menor, ¿no? Pero,
¿qué significa jefes de hogar?
que son madres que no asumen toda la responsabilidad económica de la mantención del hogar.
Vale, está claro.
¿Cómo significa que cuando esos casos son más vulnerables a earthquakes? ¿Cómo se interpreta, digamos, ese criterio?
Sí, es que como está relacionado con la pobreza, ¿no? También un segundo grado se resalta el tema de que muchos hogares están dirigidos por madres solteras, ¿no? Por madres que son jefes de hogar. Entonces, su capacidad económica también es menor, ¿no?
Sí, es un poco muy relacionado con poverty level, ¿no? Con el...
Sí.
Vale.
Sí.
Vale.
Pero, sí.
Muy bien, pues muchas gracias, Iván.
Sí,
Okay.
gracias, Iván. Y una consulta, Iván. Y estas, ¿has considerado otras ciudades y si hay alguna diferencia, o si has encontrado alguna diferencia con otras ciudades de Perú?
Sí, apliqué la metodología en Arequipa, por ejemplo, que lo presenté en otro congreso, y la dimensión predominante es la dimensión del aspecto físico más que el social, ¿no? En su área metropolitana. Entonces, por ejemplo, el elemento más vulnerable salía la localización de el C13, ¿no? Que ahora acá en Ayacucho tiene el cuarto lugar, ¿no? Entonces, ahí es que hay diferencias y la predominancia era de los elementos vulnerables de la dimensión ambiental, ¿no?
Cierto. Ok. Thank you, Iván. Thank you for your presentation.
Muchas gracias también por permitirme explayarme en español.
Okay.